Imagine a chessboard where you have spent 70 years positioning your pieces, every aircraft carrier in the right square, every military base covering the right diagonal, every alliance locking down every critical lane. Now imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your opponent did not try to take your pieces. Your opponent changed the board. That is what happened this morning in the Western Pacific. And the United States military, the most powerful fighting force in the history of human civilization, just discovered that power means nothing when the architecture underneath it shifts. At 4 a.m. local time, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand simultaneously announced the formation of the ASEAN Sovereign Security Compact, a mutual defense and economic framework that explicitly excludes the United States and explicitly includes China as a founding strategic partner. 5 nations, 680 million people, control of the Strait of Malacca, the South China Sea transit lanes, and the maritime choke points through which 42% of global trade flows. And they just told the United States that its military presence in the region is no longer welcome. Not in 5 years, not after a transition period, now. The Philippines has given the United States 90 days to vacate all military facilities on Philippine soil, including the 4 bases reestablished under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Indonesia has closed the Lombok and Sunda Straits to U.S. Navy vessels without prior diplomatic clearance. Vietnam has canceled all pending defense cooperation agreements with the Pentagon and has signed a mutual defense pact with China covering the entirety of the South China Sea. In one morning, the strategic architecture that the United States has spent 7 decades building in the Pacific was dismantled, not by war, not by conquest, by 5 phone calls and a joint press conference. In this breakdown, I am going to walk you through how this happened, why it happened, and why the Pentagon has no playbook for what comes next. I am going to show you the 4 receipts that prove China orchestrated this over the past 2 years with economic incentives that the United States never countered. I am going to reveal the Pentagon's internal assessment of what the loss of Pacific basing means for American military capability. I am going to explain why this is directly connected to the trade war and why Trump's tariff policy is the single biggest reason these 5 nations decided to switch sides. And I am going to give you 3 scenarios for what the Pacific looks like 1 year from now. Subscribe, comment, share. Because what just happened changes the global balance of power more than any event since the fall of the Soviet Union, and you need to understand it before the consequences arrive. Let me walk you through the announcement because the coordination alone tells you this was planned at the highest levels. At exactly 4 a.m. Western Pacific time, all 5 heads of state appeared on a simultaneous live broadcast. Philippine President Marcos Jr. spoke first. He said, "The Philippines has been a treaty ally of the United States for 73 years. In those 73 years, we have provided bases, transit rights, intelligence cooperation, and political support for American strategic objectives. We did this because we believed the alliance served Philippine interests. It no longer does." He continued, "In the past 6 months, the United States has imposed tariffs on Philippine exports that have cost our economy $4.3 billion. The United States has demanded that we restrict our economic relationship with China, our largest trading partner. The United States has pressured us to increase defense spending while simultaneously taxing the exports that generate the revenue to pay for that spending. The United States has treated the Philippines not as an ally, but as a subordinate. And when we asked for exemptions from tariffs that were destroying Philippine industries, we were told that America first means the Philippines last." He paused. "We reject that arrangement. Effective today, the Philippines is terminating the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. American military forces have 90 days to withdraw from all Philippine facilities. The Philippines will establish its security relationships based on respect, reciprocity, and the interests of the Filipino people, not the interests of Washington." Indonesian President Prabowo spoke next. He said, "Indonesia controls the maritime passages that connect the Pacific and Indian Oceans. We have allowed the United States Navy to transit these passages freely for decades. That freedom of transit was based on a relationship of mutual respect that no longer exists. Effective immediately, all U.S. Navy vessels require 30 days advance diplomatic clearance to transit Indonesian territorial waters, including the Lombok Strait and the Sunda Strait. Commercial vessels of all nations remain welcome. Military vessels of nations that impose economic coercion on Indonesia do not. Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim said, "The Strait of Malacca carries $3.4 trillion in trade annually. Malaysia has guaranteed safe passage through this strait as a service to the global economy. We will continue to do so, but we will no longer guarantee preferential access to any nation that uses economic warfare against our partners. The ASEAN Sovereign Security Compact ensures that decisions about maritime access are made collectively by the nations whose waters these are, not by Washington, not by anyone else." 1. Vietnamese General Secretary Nguyen spoke next and delivered perhaps the most consequential statement of all. He said, "Vietnam and China have had disagreements. Some of those disagreements involved armed conflict. But over the past 2 years, China has offered Vietnam something the United States never has. Respect for our sovereignty combined with economic partnership that benefits Vietnamese workers and Vietnamese industry." China invested $28 billion in Vietnamese infrastructure last year. The United States imposed $3.6 billion in tariffs on Vietnamese exports. The math is not complicated. Vietnam chooses partnership over punishment. Thailand's prime minister spoke last. Thailand has been a U.S. treaty ally since 1954. In those 70 years, we have watched the United States start wars we did not support, impose sanctions we did not agree with, and demand loyalty it did not reciprocate. Today, Thailand joins its ASEAN partners in choosing a new path. We remain friends of the American people, but we will no longer be tools of American foreign policy. 5 countries, 5 statements, 1 message. The United States has lost the Pacific not because China is stronger militarily. The United States has lost the Pacific because it treated its allies like vassals, taxed their economies, and assumed they had no alternatives. They found alternatives. China provided them. Receipt number 1, the Belt and Road leverage. Over the past 2 years, China has accelerated Belt and Road investment in all 5 ASEAN compact nations, $28 billion in Vietnam, $22 billion in Indonesia, $18 billion in the Philippines, $14 billion in Malaysia, $11 billion in Thailand. Total, $93 billion in infrastructure investment, ports, railroads, power plants, digital networks, that binds these economies to China's. The United States invested a combined $6.7 billion in the same 5 countries over the same period. Most of that was military aid, not economic development, guns, not roads, weapons, not jobs. China bought these alliances. It bought them with concrete and fiber optic cable and container cranes, and the United States did not even attempt to compete. Receipt number 2, the tariff trigger. According to diplomatic sources in Manila, Jakarta, and Hanoi, the final decision to form the ASEAN Compact was triggered by a single event. 6 weeks ago, the United States expanded tariffs to include Southeast Asian electronics, textiles, and agricultural products. The tariffs hit export industries that employ tens of millions of workers across the 5 nations. Philippine electronics exports to the U.S. fell 34% in 1 month. Vietnamese textile exports fell 28%. Thai agricultural exports fell 41%. Indonesian palm oil exports fell 52%. These tariffs did not punish China. China rerouted its supply chains years ago. These tariffs punished America's own allies. They punished the workers in the countries that hosted American military bases. They punished the economies that the United States needed to keep aligned against China. Trump's tariff policy did not contain China. Trump's tariff policy delivered Southeast Asia to China on a silver platter. Receipt number 3, the Pentagon warning that was ignored. 7 months ago, a classified Pentagon assessment warned that expanding tariffs to ASEAN nations would undermine military basing agreements and could push regional allies toward China. The assessment specifically identified the Philippines and Indonesia as high risk and recommended that both nations be exempted from any new tariff actions. The assessment was sent to the National Security Council. According to sources, it was never forwarded to the president. Trade advisors dismissed the Pentagon's concerns as institutional resistance to the tariff agenda. The Pentagon saw this coming. The Pentagon warned that it was coming. And the White House ignored the warning because tariff revenue mattered more than strategic alliances. Receipt number 4, the Chinese naval expansion. Within 3 hours of the ASEAN Compact announcement, China's Ministry of National Defense issued a statement confirming that China has accepted invitations from Vietnam and Indonesia to establish naval logistics facilities at Cam Ranh Bay and Surabaya. These facilities will be operational within 18 months. Cam Ranh Bay is the deep-water port that the United States built during the Vietnam War, and that has been a strategic objective for every Pacific power for a century. China just acquired access to it without firing a shot. Surabaya controls the western approach to the Lombok Strait. A Chinese naval facility there gives China the ability to monitor and potentially restrict access to the strait that connects the Pacific and Indian Oceans. In 18 months, China will have naval bases flanking every major shipping lane in Southeast Asia. The United States will have none. Now, let me show you the Pentagon's internal assessment because it is devastating. According to sources, the Joint Chiefs held an emergency session within 2 hours of the announcement. The assessment concluded the following. Loss of Philippine bases eliminates forward staging for any U.S. military operation in the South China Sea or Taiwan Strait. Without Clark and Subic Bay equivalents, the nearest major U.S. military facilities are in Guam, 1/500 miles from the Taiwan Strait and Japan, which is now the only remaining U.S. ally in the Western Pacific willing to host significant American forces. Loss of Indonesian Strait access adds 7 to 14 days to U.S. Navy transit times between the Pacific and Indian Oceans. In any conflict scenario, those additional days could be decisive. Chinese naval facilities at Cam Ranh Bay and Surabaya create a screening capability that would allow China to detect and potentially intercept U.S. naval movements throughout the South China Sea. The overall assessment is that the United States has lost its ability to project dominant military force in Southeast Asia, not because of a battle, not because of an arms race, because of trade policy. The Pentagon's recommendation to the president, according to sources, was immediate removal of all tariffs on ASEAN nations and a diplomatic offensive to reverse the compact. The Pentagon assessment stated that the military consequences of the current trajectory are, quote, more severe than any adversary action since the fall of Saigon. At 10 a.m. Eastern, Trump addressed the nation from the Oval Office. He said, "These countries are making a very bad decision, a very bad decision. China is not their friend. China will own them. They will come back to us. They always come back. And when they do, the deal will not be as good as the deal they had before." He announced no policy changes. He offered no tariff relief. He proposed no diplomatic outreach. He predicted that the ASEAN nations would reverse course on their own. Every analyst I have spoken to says that prediction is delusional. These nations have spent 2 years preparing for this moment. They have signed binding agreements. They have accepted Chinese investment that creates long-term dependency. They are not coming back. Here are 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, the strategic retreat. The United States removes tariffs on ASEAN nations, launches a massive economic engagement initiative, and offers new partnership terms that compete with Chinese investment. Some ASEAN nations soften their positions. The Philippines extends the base withdrawal timeline. Indonesia relaxes strait transit restrictions. The compact survives but becomes less exclusionary. The U.S. retains a diminished but functional presence in the Pacific. Probability, 20%. This requires a complete reversal of trade policy and a level of diplomatic engagement that the current administration has shown no capacity for. Scenario 2, the new normal. The U.S. does not change policy. The ASEAN Compact solidifies. China establishes naval facilities as planned. The U.S. consolidates its Pacific presence in Japan, Guam, and Australia. The Western Pacific becomes a Chinese sphere of influence. Taiwan becomes strategically indefensible because the U.S. cannot project force through a region controlled by Chinese-aligned nations. Within 5 years, Taiwan negotiates reunification terms with Beijing because the military guarantee that prevented it no longer exists. Probability, 55%. This is the most likely outcome because it requires no dramatic action and follows the current trajectory. Scenario 3, the confrontation. The U.S. attempts to maintain Pacific presence through force. It deploys additional carrier groups. It challenges Indonesian strait restrictions. A naval incident occurs. The crisis escalates. China invokes the ASEAN Compact's Mutual Defense Clause. The world faces the possibility of great power conflict over shipping lanes in Southeast Asia. Probability 25%. This is the nightmare scenario, and it becomes more likely every day that the underlying causes of the crisis are not addressed. I am watching three things. First, Japan's response. If Japan distances itself from the United States, the Pacific architecture collapses completely. Second, Australian reaction. Australia is the last major U.S. ally in the region that has not shifted. If Canberra wavers, it is over. Third, whether Taiwan makes any public statement about its security assessment. If Taipei signals that it no longer trusts the U.S. defense commitment, the strategic consequences become irreversible. The United States did not lose the Pacific today because China built a bigger navy. The United States lost the Pacific today because it charged its own allies for the privilege of being allies, and then was surprised when they found a partner who paid them instead. 70 years of strategic architecture, destroyed not by missiles, but by tariffs. The board has changed, and the United States is still staring at the old one.